Shalom from Jerusalem. I'm standing here on the well-known Mount of Olives, where Jesus often met not only with his disciples, but with his Father. And the Bible tells us that it was early in the morning that he would often slip away, as was his custom, to a place like this where he conversed with his Father to hear again so that he could live his assignment accurately. A place here where he would start, but would ultimately lead him to Golgotha. Below me is the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. Some of it is the same as was in Jesus' day. Some has been rebuilt, but part of it is called the Western Wall of Solomon's original temple. One that surely Jesus would have visited often to pray over the city. But here on the Mount of Olives, he would often meet with his disciples, where he would teach them and ask them as many questions, I'm sure, as they asked of him. Today I want to talk to you about questions, and specifically about several of the most important questions that Jesus asked his disciples. He often led them by asking them questions. Why? Well, let me tell you a story. I recall in my 5th grade, it was a pre-algebra class with Mr. Hayes. Now, I even remember his name. Even though I wasn't that good in pre-algebra, for some reason he just made me his pet. And I remember one day we had a test, a very tough algebra exam. I just went blank, and I guess he noticed my glazed over look, so he ambled over to my desk and stood behind me. And though he'd never give me the answers, he would always just lead me with questions. He'd say to me, "Wayne, what's the question there?" Well, the question, I said, says to find the area of the circle. So he said, "Well, what's the radius?" I said, "Well, the radius is half the diameter." "And do you remember the formula that we wrote on the board yesterday?" And I think, pi r squared is how you find the area of a circle. And he said, "Yes, and what is pi?" I said, "Pi, something sweet to eat." He said, "You're funny, but that won't help you with your test." So I said, "Oh, no, sorry. Pi was a 3.14 something else." And he said, "Close enough. Now plug that in and see what you get." "Oh," I said, "now I remember." You see, he knew that just by slipping me the answers would never get me to think for myself. You see, questions made me think, made me remember, it made me then apply. And then I would come to the conclusion on my own, with his guidance, of course, but he made me recall things. But he didn't just make me recall them, he made me recall and then apply it, try it. Jesus did the same. You see, for him to just say to the disciples, recall the answer, wouldn't be enough until it had to be applied. He wanted it applied. It had to be applied. But we're going to talk about questions, and here's one of his questions. It was just north of Galilee in Caesarea Philippi that he gathered his disciples and asked them this: "Who do men say that I am?" Good question. The disciples heard a variation of answers ranging from, well, maybe you're John the Baptist or you're Elijah. But he stopped them and said, "Who do you say that I am?" He asked that question, directing it straight to his disciples. Peter's hand shot straight up like an excited schoolboy, confident that he had the answer. And he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied and said, "Peter, you didn't get that off of the internet, did you? That one came straight from heaven." And I'm sure Peter puffed up a little bit, showing off his ability to give the right answer, when Jesus corrected him, popping his newly inflated chest. He said, "But Peter, a rooster won't crow before you will have denied me 3 times. In other words, you know the right answer, but the question is, will you be able to apply it? Peter thought, that's an unlikely thought. I'm the top dog here. I set the tone. In fact, I am the leader. And if everyone leaves you, I'm not going to leave you. You can count on me, Jesus. I'll be around. But Peter knew the answer. He knew the answer all right, but What he didn't know was that he was about to be tested. You see, knowing the correct answer, correct response, it's good. But it's nothing unless you pass the reality check and it can be applied. You see, you can be a winner at Bible trivia and Sunday school, but it's not where it counts. It's not what you do in church that's most important. It's when we leave church that is. Because you see, later on in this place, Jesus is going to be betrayed by Judas Iscariot. And the next day, he's going to be tried before the high priest, Annas and Caiaphas, and Peter will be sitting incognito to sort of find out what's about to happen with his master when a slave girl recognizes him and she looks at him and says, "Aren't you one of his disciples? You've been following this Jesus around." And Peter, afraid that Jesus' fate might become his as well, he replies, "Nope, no, I don't know him." A second time she repeats herself. "No," she said, "I saw you. You were with him with the other disciples." He said, "No, I'm not." And he gets a little mad. "Now knock it off. You got me mixed up with somebody else." Makes up some excuse. And then she looks again and says, "I'm sure it was you. I'm sure it was you." And then Matthew's gospel records these words, that he began to curse and swear. "I don't know this man." And immediately a rooster crowed. Well, sorry, Peter. Your grade? F. You see, you knew the right words, but that's where it ended. But before we get excessively down on Peter, before we use Peter as a bad example of life, let's use him as a mirror. It's as if Jesus is saying to you and me, "Do you know me? Then live it. Live it." When I was a youth pastor, I would go into the high school and I'd have a little Bible, a pocket Bible. When students would ask me a question about Jesus, I'd whip it out and turn to the pages and kind of share with them about Christ. And one of the teachers didn't like Christians, and so as I passed by him, he'd go, "How you doing, Mr. Gospel?" I'd say, "My name's Wayne." He said, No, Mr. Gospel." And I'd come each day to the lunchroom, and again he'd just kind of swagger his head and say, "Hey there, Mr. Gospel." And I remember one day I went to the car and I banged on my steering wheel and I said, "God, my name is Wayne, not Mr. Gospel. I'm sick and tired of this guy calling me Mr. Gospel. Who does he think he is?" And it was almost as if the Lord just spoke to my heart and said, "What would you rather be known by? What would you rather identify with in the whole universe other than that which will bring redemption and salvation to mankind?" He's identifying you with the greatest gift man has ever received. He's identifying you with that, and that's not good enough. Jesus said, if that's not good enough, nothing is. And boy, after he said that, I thought, I am honored to be called Mr. Gospel. Sometimes, we think, well, we want to be a Christian and we want to know Christ and we want to be someone that represents him, but when we're tested, it's like we implode, we draw back and recede. It's not enough just knowing the right answers and knowing who Jesus is. You see, knowing who Jesus is fine. But the real question is, can we apply it when we're tested? Can it be something we live, or is it just something we know? How often we know all there is to know, let's say, about love, but there's not much love in our home. We can know all there is to know about forgiveness, but we just can't forgive. We know all there is to know about peace, but there's not peace in our hearts. So what do? Jesus is saying this. Do you know who I am? Yeah, I do. Now live it. Live it. Then and only then will you know who I really am. So come, as we travel to the shores of Galilee, where Jesus is about to ask Peter another question, one that, like the first, will be tested in the cauldron of his life. Welcome to the Sea of Galilee on this beautiful morning. I started my leisurely morning stroll from the other side of the water. It was a transparent blue under my feet. My socks got a little wet, but other than that, I'm fine. Now, I'm not sure where the other two are that started with me. I think it was Ken Silva and Keola Richards, but somewhere in the middle, I think they started to doubt. Anyway, I'm here. And actually, I'm at the very place where Jesus met with Peter after the resurrection. Let's take a look at the second question Jesus is about to ask. Now, you have to remember that Peter, for 3 years now, saw the good in Jesus and also the bad and the ugly in mankind. 3 years and hundreds of miles and more experiences packed into 36 months than any one of us could have fit in a dozen lifetimes. But not everything was exciting as Peter had thought. And some of the unexpected twists just weren't what Peter had signed up for. But his discouragement and maybe his immaturity didn't always bring about the most sterling of responses from him either. He'd talk way too much, put his foot in his mouth, deny Jesus to a slave girl, and he'd even resort to slicing off a man's ear just because he wanted him to back off. And Peter would be reminded of these failures each time he'd hear the morning's dawn break by a rooster's crow. The reminiscence of too many failures, and now, with the absence of the Savior, he was left with unanswered questions. But Jesus was about to fix that. So Peter and a few disgruntled disciples resigned their apostolic credentials and traded them in for a few casting rods and headed for their usual fishing grounds. The night struggled long until the early morning sunlight spilled a soft golden glow over the surface of this lake. And these veteran fishermen would always come home with a catch, but this time it would be different. It was then that a voice would break the morning still. The scripture says this: Jesus, unbeknownst to them, was speaking, and he said, "Children, have you caught any fish?" "No," the disciples answered, somewhat perturbed just by this novice unknown giving them a bit of neighborly advice. The voice continued, "Why don't you cast your nets on the right-hand side of the boat? I promise," said this voice, "you'll find a catch." Now, Peter either fixed on disproving this stranger or maybe just to humor this man a little bit. He decided to tell his depleted crew to throw their nets over the starboard side. So they flung their nets, but when they began to retrieve the nets, it felt like as if they were snagged on the bottom of the lake. They couldn't pull it in. Well, at that point, they, continuing to tug, looked down and found that it was filled with fish. There were so many fish, they couldn't even pull it in. This voice said, "Children, haven't caught any fish, have you?" "No," the disciples answered, somewhat perturbed by this novice giving them a bit of advice. Well, his voice continued, "Why don't you cast your nets on the right-hand side of the boat? I promise if you do, you'll find a catch." Now, Peter either fixed on disproving him or maybe just to humor the depleted crew that had been fighting all night, he decided to order the nets flung over the starboard side. But when they began to retrieve the nets, it felt as if They were snagged fast on the bottom. They continued to tug and found that there were so many fish that they could hardly haul the nets into the boat. One of the disciples yelled, "It's the Lord!" When Peter heard this, he immediately plunged overboard, freestyled it towards the shore. Arriving at this place, he found Jesus sitting by a newly ignited charcoal fire. The disciples soon arrived with their haul of fish, and skipping with the formalities, Jesus pointed towards the bulging nets of fish and he asked Peter a question. "Peter," he said, "do you love me more than these fish?" Peter assured him that he did. So Jesus replied, "Then leave these fish and find my lambs." And almost without waiting for Peter to fully comprehend what he was saying, Jesus asked him a second question. "Peter, do you love me more than these fish?" "Absolutely," Peter replied. And then Jesus followed up. "Then leave the ocean here, leave the Sea of Galilee, and head for the pastures. My sheep need a shepherd." Now, Jesus must have stirred the hot coals of Peter's heart, because a third time he asked him a question. "Peter, do you love me?" Peter was certain that Jesus knew his answer before he even replied. He always did. "Yes," he said, "I love you." He said, mixed with a little grief, because he had to ask him 3 times. Then Jesus countered, "Then leave these fish, find my sheep." Often, in order to go after one thing, you have to leave another. And for Peter, it meant leaving the fish and opting for sheep. "Do you love me? Then leave the fish." Following isn't just going. It may include leaving. You see, in order to follow Jesus, we need to be willing to leave behind certain things that have been weighing us down. He could ask you and me, "Do you love me enough to leave this propensity of yours towards skepticism? Do you love me enough to leave those old habits or those doubts, that the nets of your life bulging with anger or lust or selfishness, pride or ego, like fish skipping all over? Or do you love me enough to leave always demanding credit, that habit that you have?" Personally, my nets were full of them. And it seems like every time I emptied them, they'd fill back up with old habits and old doubts. So this is a question Jesus asks me often, and I need to answer him often. For example, in the middle of an escalating argument, the Lord will ask me, "Do you love me? Do you? Yes, then leave it." You see, when barbed words or unfair expectations are lobbed my way like grenades with pins pulled, I can hear him again. "Wayne, do you love me?" "Yes." "Then leave it." What? Just leave it. It might not always be fish we need to leave in order to deepen our commitment. It's usually, for me, a habit or a negative attitude, or more often my right to retaliate, to defend myself, to excuse my actions, or to point out to my accusers their faults, which I think are much bigger than mine. And when I'm about to do that, I can often hear the Lord say, "Wayne, do you love me?" "Yes." "Then leave it. Leave it. There's more important fish to fry." Let me ask you, what do you need to leave behind today that maybe you need to leave once and for all? I know I have a net full of habits and doubts and skepticisms and ego, pride, all kinds of things. And they've been with me for so long, sometimes they're starting to smell like dragging a net of fish for months. Take a few minutes to recall what Jesus has been asking you to leave behind, and do so. And when you do, it may just bring about a fresh, new fragrance of God's grace that has been eluding you for so long due to the rancid odor of dragging those fish around. So, come with me now for a final stop at a place near Jerusalem where Jesus asks the third and final question, one that holds an assignment for every one of us. We're standing here on the east side of Jerusalem, but one of the things that you'll notice in an uncanny way are tens of thousands of graves just outside the wall of Jerusalem. And I'm just not wondering if Jesus foresaw something like this when, after 3.5 years of ministry and miracles, he would ask one final question. In fact, I want to ask you this final question. And the question is this: after all the miracles, all the things that you've seen that Jesus do, how open is your heart? How open is your heart to being fully aware of all that Jesus wants for you and ready to throw everything over the line? Because you see, Jesus looked over this city after years of ministry and miracles, and the people still wouldn't open their hearts to the Messiah. In fact, Jesus could see that soon they would turn on him like a pack of dogs, only to have him crucified like a common criminal. In fact, in Matthew 23:37, we find his prayer over the city. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. You can sense the compassionate heart of Jesus, and maybe even with a little slight edge of sadness. You know that Jesus often prayed for the city, and he would often pray for the disciples back then and for his disciples yet today. I know he still prays for us. In fact, hear one of his prayers that he prayed for us. The scripture says this: I pray also for those who will believe in me, that all of them may be one, Father. One, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world will believe that you have sent me. That was in John chapter 17. So here lies the final question. Can you hear him praying for you? Can you hear him praying for us? Because he is. And let me ask you this question. If he indeed is praying for us, which we know he is, how many times, in converse now, how many times, knowing that he's prayed for us and is, how many times has he answered our prayers when we've prayed to him? Prayers for your safety, prayers for finances, for forgiveness. How many times do you think Jesus answered your prayers that you prayed to him? Maybe 1,000 or 100,000 times he's answered your prayers and mine. That he kept you safe or led you out of a financial mess. He kept you from going over the edge. How many times do you think he's answered your prayers and mine? Hundreds of thousands. Well, here's one prayer that we could answer for him. Just one. I mean, he's answered so many for us. The least we can do is answer one of his. And that is this. He says, Father, I pray the church would be one. just as you are in me and I am in you. May the church be one, so the world will believe that the gospel is credible, is real. In this next season of New Hope, let's live what we know. Leave behind excuses to follow Him, wrong habits to follow Him, wrong perspectives, and let's answer one of His prayers that He prayed from this place, that we'd be one. Why? The Bible says it's because of our love for one another that the world will believe that the gospel really works. Let me tell you a story of one of the ladies that joined our trip here to Israel. She came on the trip and was having some physical problems, but yet she came and joined us, and she was having struggle to the point where she couldn't walk. It worsened day by day, and she had to actually be taken to a physician who prescribed some medication so that she can just function. And later, in fact, it was just last night, I saw her and found out that in one of the morning devotionals that we have along the way here, she gave her heart to Christ. I didn't know she wasn't a Christian before the trip. But you know, her attitude throughout this whole trip, even in the midst of her pain and suffering, was just amazing. She always had a smile. She was always willing. We said, stay on the bus, because she couldn't walk. And she said, no, I might miss something, and I won't be with these people. I thought, wow. I stopped and just told her how much I appreciated her spirit. And this is when she replied. She says, oh no. She said, when I joined this group from the very beginning, she says, there was like a light that just shone around everyone. And I was watching all of you, and because she's from the Midwest, and she said, all of you just loved one another so much. It just drew me in. And I knew I wanted to be a part of this kind of family. In fact, she said, when I go back to the Midwest, I'm telling my husband we're moving to Hawaii to be a part of this church. I thought that's what Jesus was saying. He was saying, I pray that the church would be one so that the world would believe that you, Father, sent me, and that through their love, people will believe that I'm alive and that the gospel is alive in my people. You see, the best evangelism we can do is not just to know the right answers, but is to live the right answers. And for example, when issues pop up, we have enough courage to remember what Jesus asked. Do you love me more than hanging on to this? Yeah, then leave it. Leave it behind. We won't die on that hill. Why? Because we remember the question He asked. Do you love me more than that? Hanging on to that. Having your pride hang on to that, to keep that credit. Do you love me enough to leave it? I do. And then we leave it. You see, Peter, do you know me? I do. Don't just know the right answer. Can you live the right answer? And then, can you be at one with one another? Can you? Yeah, Lord. Can you hear Him praying? Yeah, I do, Lord. Then let's live it. I mean, really be one with one another for this season. To be profuse with encouragement, to overflow with appreciation for each other, to go above and beyond the call of duty to serve. And in doing so, just like our traveler said, there will be a glow on the people of God, some light that shines. And we'll realize that maybe finally we answered at least one of His prayers. He's answered thousands for us. Maybe we can answer one of His. Can you hear Him praying? Then let's live it. And when you do, watch what He's about to do for our church and for our future. It'll be just absolutely amazing. You watch, you wait, you'll see.